There is a short stretch of pavement on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan where, on the evening of December 16th, 1985, the office workers streaming out of the buildings nearby heard something they would spend years trying to describe. Not a car backfiring, they would say. Not something that could be explained by the ordinary sounds of a city in December. Something else. And then the running, and the shouting, and the sirens that began so quickly it seemed like they were already there. What they had heard was the sound of one of the most powerful criminal empires in American history, destroying itself from the inside. The man who died on the pavement that evening beside the black Lincoln was not the boss of that empire. He was its second man, appointed to the position 14 days earlier when the underboss who had preceded him died of cancer in a hospital in Queens. Before that appointment, he had spent the better part of 2 decades driving the boss's car, protecting the boss's body, keeping the boss's secrets, and running the boss's concrete company on Staten Island. He was the most loyal man in an organization that ran on loyalty, and the moment his boss elevated him to a position of his own was the moment the men who wanted the boss dead decided that the bodyguard had to go too. His name was Thomas Bilotti. The men in his world called him Tommy, and the story of what he built, what he was, and what it cost him to be finally visible after so many years of being invisible is one of the more complete accounts of what loyalty produces and what it cannot protect against in American organized crime. Drop where you are watching from in the comments. It is one of the best things about doing this kind of history. If you are new here and you want stories like this one delivered directly to you, now is the time to subscribe. Back to Staten Island and the man who spent 20 years driving someone else's car before he became the most dangerous man in New York for 14 days. The man in the driver's seat on East 46th Street that evening was born 24 miles away, on an island that in 1940 was as much a Gambino province as it was a New York City borough. Thomas Bilotti arrived on March 23rd, 1940, the third child of Anthony Bilotti and Lillian Rosso Bilotti, both immigrants of Italian descent, living in a neighborhood where the line between working-class community life and organized crime ran through the same streets, the same social clubs, the same families. Anthony Bilotti's other sons were James, who would eventually spend years working as a bodyguard for the singer Frank Sinatra in Las Vegas, Philip, who would die in June of 1976, and Joseph, who would follow his brother Thomas into the Gambino family. The organization that shaped Staten Island's criminal landscape in those years was the network that bore Carlo Gambino's name, and its presence on the island was managed through a set of overlapping crews that controlled gambling, the waterfront, and the rackets that governed how goods moved and who benefited from that movement. John D'Alessio, a capo regime in the Gambino family, ran a crew that controlled illegal gambling and other operations across the island. His brothers Alexander, known as Pope, and Michael, known as Mikey D, operated alongside him. Their uncle, Alexander Debrisi, who went by the Ox, controlled the Staten Island waterfront for the family and occupied a position in the organizational hierarchy that made him one of the most consequential figures in the island's criminal landscape. For a young man growing up in this specific geography, entry into that world was not an unusual outcome. It was, for a particular kind of young man with a particular set of qualities, the most natural path available. Tommy Bilotti had those qualities in abundance. He was physically formidable. He would eventually reach 5 feet 7 and settle at a rock-solid 220 pounds, described by the federal agents, who would later study him as barrel-chested, short-necked, and built with the kind of density that made him look as though he had been compressed from something larger. He was capable of sudden and extreme violence in a way that his neighborhood recognized and rewarded, and he was loyal, with the specific kind of loyalty that does not calculate outcomes or weigh options, but simply attaches itself and holds. He came into the orbit of the D'Alessio crew as a young man and absorbed the organizational rhythms of the operation from the ground level. He served as a chauffeur and bodyguard for Alexander Debrisi. learning in the most direct way possible what it meant to keep someone powerful safe, to anticipate threats, to be present at all times in the way that a man who protects another man must be present. The waterfront work, the gambling operations, the loan sharking that ran through the crew like water through pipes. Bilotti absorbed all of it, and he added to it the quality that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. He was not merely willing to be violent, he was, by all the documentation that survives, genuinely comfortable with it. The neighborhood produced him, and then the neighborhood watched what it had produced, and what came next was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. What the Dellacroce crew work produced over the course of several years was a reputation. In the world Tommy Bilotti occupied, reputation was not abstract, it was operational. It determined what assignments you received, what trust you were extended, and how quickly your telephone was answered when you called in a favor. Bilotti's reputation was built on a specific set of qualities. He was feared, he was reliable, and he did not talk about things that did not need to be talked about. The legal record that began accumulating in 1969 captured only the surface of what he was doing. In that year, he was arrested on Staten Island on a felony charge of possessing stolen property. The charge was not the most serious thing he was involved in, and the arrest was not the most instructive incident of the period. April of 1970 produced a more revealing episode. Bilotti and an accomplice named Thomas Papinier were observed discarding firearms and arrested following a shooting in Jamesburg, New Jersey. The victim was a teenager named Emery Parks, who suffered superficial injuries from birdshot pellets that struck the back of his head. The arrest came at a particularly volatile moment. The Jamesburg area was in the midst of serious racial tension following riots at the local high school, and police from neighboring municipalities were on alert. Despite suspecting the pair's role in Parks's injuries, investigators could only make charges stick for illegal possession of concealed weapons. A Middlesex County grand jury ultimately indicted both men on that count alone. The Ernst affair was more complicated and more instructive. In 1971, John Dellacroce recruited Bilotti and his brother Joseph to murder a man named Thomas Ernst, who was the common-law husband of Dellacroce's daughter Teresa, and who Dellacroce had decided needed to be removed. The situation produced two failed attempts that told something essential about how organized violence actually unfolds when the variables are not controlled. The first attempt on August 31, 1971, at a diner in Grasmere, Staten Island, did not succeed. A second attempt on September 2, 1971, outside Dellacroce's country home near the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, also failed. Teresa Dellacroce, who was not supposed to be present, returned fire with a semi-automatic rifle. Ernst survived this attempt as well, and reportedly identified the two shooters to Pennsylvania State Police before withdrawing the identification. Ernst was ultimately killed on April 6, 1972, shot by an unidentified gunman on the porch of Dellacroce's home at 151 Jumel Street in Great Kills, Staten Island. The violence was not incidental to who Bilotti was. It was definitional. Federal agents Joseph O'Brien and Andrus Currens, who would spend years investigating the Gambino family and who came to know Bilotti in the way that surveillance work produces a specific kind of knowledge, described him in their account of the investigation with a precision that has not been improved upon. A pit bull with shoes on. 5'7", 220 pounds. A bad toupee. Piggish eyes set too close together. No tact, no charm, no sense of humor. If he had any business ability beyond the choreography of a shakedown or the calculation of loan, sharking interests, they wrote, it did not show. As a stranger to self-control, they added, he was complete. But those same agents also noted the other side of the ledger: vigilant, hardworking, fearless, and above all loyal. Those qualities were not separate from the violence and the cruelty. They were part of the same formation. A man who could walk into a bar carrying a baseball bat to collect an interest payment from an owner still recovering from a prior beating who could berate the patrons and the owner with sadistic theater before leaving, was also a man who, when standing next to his boss, was described by those same federal agents as deferential, subdued, watchful, and calm, like a dog on a rug. The two things were not contradictory. They were the same disposition operating under different conditions. The specific incident the agents documented, where Bilotti entered a Staten Island bar to collect an interest payment and subjected the injured owner and his customers to a display of gratuitous cruelty that went far beyond what the collection required, was understood by the men who observed it as illustration of a fundamental truth. Bilotti, when supervised, was one thing. Bilotti, when unsupervised, was something that required warnings. The FBI supervisor Bruce Moole, who ran the squad assigned to the Gambino family, told Agent O'Brien directly, "Do not ever talk to Tommy Bilotti alone. He does not play by the rules, and he has a very short fuse." This was not a casual observation. It was an assessment formed from watching the man operate over time. Bilotti was allegedly involved in at least 11 murders over the course of his criminal career, though the specific number was not established as a definitive figure in any court proceeding. What was established in the cumulative record of his activities was that he was one of the most capable and most dangerous enforcers in the Gambino family's operational structure. He would need to be for the position he was being built toward, even if neither he nor the men around him fully understood yet what that position would require. Among the men Bilotti came to know through the D'Alessio crew's broader Gambino connections was a capo named Paul Castellano. The connection was not immediate or dramatic. It developed over time in the way that such relationships develop in closed organizational worlds through shared operations, mutual acquaintance, and the gradual recognition on both sides that something useful was available. Castellano, who was known in the family as Big Paul, was a different kind of man from anyone else Tommy Bilotti had worked for. He was businesslike in his approach to organized crime in a way that was unusual for his generation and his organization. He thought about legitimate enterprises as covers and as genuine income streams simultaneously. He dressed well and spoke carefully and cultivated the manner of an executive as much as a gangster. He was, in the assessment of the men who studied him most closely, a mobster who thought of himself primarily as a businessman. What drew Castellano to Bilotti was not any similarity between them. It was, specifically, the difference. Castellano was a man who understood that a boss needs certain things around him that he himself cannot provide, and one of those things is someone who will absorb physical threat, enforce financial obligation, and handle the violent currency of the world he operates in without requiring explanation or instruction. Bilotti was that person. Federal agents O'Brien and Currens, who eventually produced a detailed portrait of their relationship, described the specific dynamic with precision. As long as Bilotti was waiting on Paul Castellano, he was deferential, subdued, watchful, yet calm. His self-esteem derived from adoration of the master, and he could afford to be well behaved. Problems occurred when he was sent on errands of his own. Out of sight of the boss, he got rambunctious, tried to play the big shot, overdid things, and was creative in a sadistic sort of way that embroidered gratuitous cruelty through what should have been straightforward business transactions. This was the architecture of the relationship. One man whose authority and discipline Bilotti genuinely respected, and one man whose loyalty Castellano had secured in the most complete way possible by becoming the fixed point around which Bilotti's entire organizational identity organized itself. The domestic texture of the alliance was specific. Bilotti kept Castellano's affair with his live-in maid, Gloria Olarte, secret from Castellano's wife Nina. He accompanied the boss on vacations to Pompano Beach, Florida. He was a regular visitor and dinner guest at the boss's homes, considered a member of the extended family circle. The intimacy was not merely professional, it was personal in the way that such relationships, formed over years of shared danger and shared enterprise, inevitably become personal. Bilotti's own personal life ran parallel to this long professional attachment. His first wife, Catherine, died of cancer in her mid-30s. He remarried a woman named Donna, who owned a beauty parlor in Brooklyn called Faces. He had a severely autistic son who had been institutionalized since childhood. Bilotti visited the boy regularly and rarely spoke of him. He was the best man at the wedding of actor Gianni Russo, a fellow Staten Island native who had played Carlo Rizzi in The Godfather. He was, in his private life, a man of genuine attachment, capable of loyalty and care in precisely the registers where his professional life demanded something closer to brutality. He was formally inducted as a made member of the Gambino family in October 1977. The ceremony conferred on him a status that the years of work had already earned in practical terms. He was, in the language of that world, one of them, and had been in every meaningful sense for some time before the ritual confirmed it. Carlo Gambino died of heart disease on October 15, 1976, and the question of who would lead the largest criminal organization in the United States was answered in a way that fractured that organization for the next 9 years. Gambino's decision to name Paul Castellano as his successor was made possible by the specific personal relationship between them. Castellano had married Gambino's sister, making him both cousin and brother-in-law to the man whose organization he was inheriting. The choice bypassed the family's long-serving underboss, Aniello Dellacroce, a decision that required immediate management. Dellacroce, known as Mr. Neal, was not a man who could be simply passed over without consequence. He had served as underboss since 1965. He had been Albert Anastasia's protege. He ran the Manhattan street crews from the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, and those crews included some of the most capable and most dangerous men in the organization. An NYPD detective who knew him told the press that Dellacroce's eyes showed you how frightening they were. The frigid glare of a killer. The arrangement Castellano and Dellacroce reached preserved the organization's peace at the cost of its coherence. Dellacroce remained as underboss, continuing to control the street crews and the Manhattan operations. Castellano concentrated on what he was best at: the business side, the white-collar rackets, the construction industry connections, the labor union relationships. The family split, functionally if not formally, into two factions. Castellano's faction was based in Brooklyn and Staten Island, and it ran what the agents who observed it called white-collar crime, corporate-level racketeering, real estate, contracts, supply chains. Dellacroce's faction ran what it had always run: the street, the traditional rackets, the crews that operated from social clubs in Manhattan and Queens. Bilotti was inducted into this divided organization in October of 1977. His brother Joseph followed in 1980. When Castellano moved into a custom-built mansion at 177 Benedict Road, atop Todt Hill in Staten Island in 1980, Bilotti moved into a less ostentatious home nearby. The physical proximity was a statement about the relationship. So was the contrast between the two houses. In the fall of 1981, Castellano promoted Bilotti to capo. The crew Bilotti now commanded included his brother Joseph and a man named John Gambino. The elevation was not incidental. It positioned Bilotti, for the first time, as an operational figure in his own right, rather than purely as an extension of the boss's personal security. The concrete business grew from this period. Bilotti and Castellano were partners in Scara-Mix, a concrete supply company headquartered at 2537 Richmond Terrace in West New Brighton, Staten Island. Paul Castellano's son Philip was installed as president. Bilotti served as vice president, overseeing day-to-day operations on construction projects across New York City and New Jersey. Between 1984 and 1986, Scara-Mix obtained more than $2 million in subcontracts from the city and the Transit Authority. The company's value was not limited to its direct revenues. It was a mechanism for the Gambino family's broader control of the construction industry, through which, as Gravano would later testify, no concrete contract in New York City worth more than $2 million could be awarded without Castellano's approval. Bilotti was also the Gambino family's point of contact with steam fitters, Local 638 of the Plumbers Union. George Daly, an associate who belonged to Bilotti's crew, served as the local's business agent and used that position to generate income for the organization until his conviction in 1987 on charges of soliciting bribes in exchange for labor peace. The empire, as it had been built and as it operated, was embedded in the legitimate economy in ways that made it difficult to see and difficult to prosecute. The concrete company had real contracts and real employees. The union had real members and real functions. The structure that sustained it was criminal, but the structure was not visible to anyone who was not already looking for it. The FBI was looking for it. In 1983, agents planted an electronic listening device inside Castellano's Todt Hill mansion. What the device produced was far more comprehensive than the agents had expected. Recordings of organizational discussions, financial arrangements, personnel decisions, and the inner workings of a criminal enterprise that had always operated in deliberate obscurity. The recordings also produced something unexpected. They captured the details of Castellano's affair with Gloria Olarte, his live-in maid, revealing a domestic situation that Bilotti had been protecting for years. The legal consequences of that surveillance accumulated quickly. In March of 1984, federal prosecutors charged Castellano and 20 others with racketeering, extortion, drug trafficking, prostitution, and 25 alleged murders. Castellano was arrested and released. Then, on February 25, 1985, U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani convened one of the most ambitious prosecutions in the history of American organized crime. Castellano and 8 other crime family bosses were indicted as members of the Mafia Commission, the ruling body that governed the 5 families' relationships and dispute resolution. Castellano posted $2 million in bail and was released. A separate trial in the car theft and murder case began in October of 1985. Through all of it, Bilotti was at his boss's side. The footage from the courthouse steps, repeated across the news programs of that era, showed the same image again and again. The tall, elegant Castellano moving through the cameras, and beside him, a few feet back and slightly to the side, the shorter, thicker figure of Tommy Bilotti, watchful, his eyes moving to check the perimeter even as the cameras captured his face. The posture was the same one the federal agents had described in their surveillance logs, like a dog on a rug, but a dog who never stopped calculating where the threat was coming from. The legal crisis Castellano was navigating in federal court was the one law enforcement could see. The other crisis was internal, and it had been building since before the indictments. At its center was narcotics. Castellano had imposed a strict ban on drug dealing within the Gambino family, with the death penalty as the stated consequence of violation. The rule was enforced inconsistently, as such rules in criminal organizations tend to be, but it was the rule and it had the force of the boss's explicit authority behind it. John Gotti's crew, which operated under Dellacroce's faction and was based in the Ozone Park neighborhood of Queens, was dealing heroin in defiance of it. Angelo Ruggiero, a Gotti associate and childhood friend, was caught on wiretap in the early 1980s discussing the operation in enough detail to constitute a comprehensive record of the Gambino family's involvement in heroin trafficking. The transcripts of those recordings, when they became available to defense attorneys as required by the rules of federal discovery, created an immediate crisis. Castellano demanded that Dellacroce give him copies. Dellacroce stalled. The reason for the stalling was not obscure. The transcripts would have shown Castellano that Gotti's crew had been dealing in heroin in direct violation of his standing order, and the consequence of that knowledge was predictable. Gotti and Ruggiero understood what Castellano's response would be. The ban on drugs was explicit, and Castellano had enforced it against others. Gotti's crew had ample reason to believe they would not be treated differently. Dellacroce managed the situation for as long as he could, using his standing in the family and his personal relationship with Castellano to defer the moment when the transcripts would have to be surrendered. He died before that moment arrived. By late 1985, a second piece of the crisis had emerged. Word had filtered to Gotti through the family's internal channels that Castellano was planning to break up his crew over the drug dealing. The information, whether precisely accurate or slightly distorted in its transmission, changed the calculation entirely. The factions that had been in uneasy coexistence for 9 years were now in a situation where each side understood that the other side was preparing to move. For Gotti and the men around him, the arithmetic was clear. A man who is going to be killed has every reason to kill first. The question was no longer whether to act, but when and how. 5 men formed the core of the conspiracy that would answer those questions. Gotti himself, Joseph Armone, known as Joe Piney, a respected Gambino figure with connections across the family's factions, Frank De Chico, a Castellano loyalist who had concluded that loyalty to this particular Castellano was no longer an asset worth preserving, Robert DiBernardo, known as DB, and Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull, who would later provide the most detailed account of what the 5 of them decided and how they decided it. Together they were referred to in subsequent proceedings and reporting as the Fist. The protection that had kept these tensions from producing violence for 9 years was Aniello Dellacroce. As long as Dellacroce was alive, his authority over the Manhattan faction and his personal relationship with Gotti served as a brake on whatever anyone else might want to do. Once he was gone, there was nothing between the two sides and the reckoning that had been building since 1976. Aniello Dellacroce died of cancer on December 2nd, 1985, at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens. He was 71 years old. Castellano did not attend the wake. He cited his legal situation and the constant media attention as reasons to avoid appearing at a public event associated with a prominent organized crime figure. For the men of Dellacroce's faction, the explanation was beside the point. A boss who did not attend the wake of his underboss, a man who had served him loyally for 9 years and held the family together across a fundamental division of interest, was a boss who had communicated something that no legal justification could undo. What came immediately after was the second provocation, delivered within days of the first. Castellano named Tommy Bilotti as the new underboss. The appointment was not, to the men who received the news, a neutral organizational decision. Bilotti was Castellano's man in a specific and total sense, his driver, his bodyguard, his concrete business partner, the keeper of his domestic secrets. He was, in the assessment that spread quickly through the family's informal communication channels, a chauffeur who was being elevated over men with real organizational standing, real crew management experience, and real claims to the position. Capos who had spent years building their operations and their reputations within the family received the news and understood what it meant about where they stood in Castellano's estimation. The double insult, delivered within days, was the condition the Fist had been waiting for. The plan existed. The question had always been when the opportunity would arise. Frank De Chico, who had been one of Castellano's closest associates, and who had therefore legitimate access to the boss's schedule, provided the answer. There was a meeting set at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan for December 16th, 1985. Castellano would be there. Bilotti, who drove him everywhere, would be there. The assembled team consisted of approximately 11 men. The primary shooters were Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia, 3 Gambino soldiers positioned near the restaurant entrance. The backup positions down the street were held by Dominic Pizzonia, Angelo Ruggiero, and Tony Rampino. John Gotti and Salvatore Gravano would observe from a car parked across the street, close enough to confirm the operation and give the signal. The shooters were dressed in beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats, a combination that would allow them to move through the Manhattan street crowd on a December evening without attracting the attention that a cluster of men near a restaurant entrance might otherwise draw. Gravano would later recall that the hat choice may have been Ruggiero's contribution to the planning. On the morning of December 16th, 1985, Thomas Bilotti woke up as the underboss of the Gambino crime family. He had held the position for 14 days. The corner of East 46th Street and 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan on December 16th, 1985, was what Midtown Manhattan is every weekday afternoon in the 3rd week of December, crowded, moving fast, layered with Christmas decorations and the noise of office workers and shoppers making their way through the early evening rush. The street outside Sparks Steakhouse was not different from the other streets in the block surrounding it. It was busy, it was lit, and it was full of people who had no idea what had been arranged for that particular address at that particular time. The black Lincoln carrying Castellano and Bilotti pulled to the front of the restaurant at approximately 26 minutes past 5 in the afternoon. The primary shooters were already in position. Castellano exited from the passenger side and stepped onto the pavement. The gunman moved. He was struck multiple times. John Corneglia has been identified in subsequent accounts as the man who fired into Castellano's head. The boss of the Gambino crime family fell on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse and did not get up. Bilotti came out of the driver's door. He was shot before he could respond to what was happening on the other side of the car. What he had spent 2 decades doing, the protection of the man in the back seat, was no longer possible. The man he had protected was already down. The $6,300 that police found in Bilotti's pockets when they reached him was not a weapon. He had not been carrying one. He fell in the street beside the car he had driven there, and the rivulets of blood that ran from his body made their way across the pavement toward the curb. An off-duty registered nurse who was in the area went to Bilotti's side and attempted to revive him at the scene. The attempt failed. Gotti drove past the bodies before leaving. The operation had taken less than 90 seconds when the New York Police Department and the FBI arrived at East 46th Street and set up the portable lighting that made the crime scene look, in the words of one account, like a macabre movie set. The dimensions of what had happened were already clear. 2 dead bodies on the pavement of Midtown Manhattan in Christmas shopping season. The boss of the most powerful criminal family in the United States and his newly appointed second-in-command, killed in a coordinated ambush executed with military efficiency. This was not a usual homicide. Nobody who arrived at the scene thought it was. Paul Castellano was 50 yards from Thomas Bilotti when they were buried. Moravian Cemetery, New Dorp, Staten Island, the same neighborhood they had both spent their adult lives working from and protecting, the same ground where the organization they had both served held its roots. The night of December 16th produced 2 immediate effects that operated in parallel and pulled in opposite directions. For the Gambino family, the question of succession was answered quickly. Gotti presented himself as the natural next leader, and the men who had been part of the conspiracy, or who had observed it, were in no position to argue. The organizational mechanics of a coup require that the aftermath be managed decisively, and Gotti was decisive. On January 15, 1986, a meeting of 20 Gambino capos formally acclaimed him as the new boss. Frank De Chico was appointed underboss. Angelo Ruggiero and Salvatore Gravano were elevated to the position of capo. For Bilotti's family, the night produced a different set of consequences. His wife Donna suffered a nervous breakdown and a miscarriage in the weeks that followed. He had left behind 10 children. The youngest was a daughter who was 6 weeks old on December 16th. His autistic son, who had spent his entire life in an institution and who his father had visited regularly without discussing with anyone, would continue to live there without the visits. The loan sharking book that Bilotti had maintained, the financial instrument that represented years of accumulated street-level credit relationships, was given by Gotti to a man named Joe Watts, a reward for Watts's participation in the Sparks operation as a backup shooter. Bilotti's former home on Staten Island was eventually purchased by actor Steven Seagal. The organization that had caused all of this was not finished punishing itself for it. 4 months after the Sparks assassination, the reckoning came from outside the Gambino family. Vincent Gigante, the Genovese boss who had been one of Paul Castellano's closest allies among the 5 families' leadership, organized a response to what he and others regarded as an unforgivable violation of protocol. The murder of a sitting boss without commissioned authorization was, in the specific code that governed interfamily relations, an offense that demanded a penalty. Gigante recruited Lucchese family leaders to assist, and the target was John Gotti. On April 13th, 1986, a man named Herbert Pate, an associate with no visible connection to the Gambino family, approached a meeting at the Veterans and Friends Social Club on 86th Street in Dyker Heights, Brooklyn. He carried a bomb constructed from plastic explosives with a remote-controlled detonation mechanism. The device was planted beneath the Buick belonging to Frank DeCicco, who was inside the club at a meeting where Gotti was expected to be present. Gotti was not there. He had changed his plans. A Lucchese soldier named Frank Bellino, who bore a resemblance to Gotti, walked out of the club toward DeCicco's car. The bomb detonated. DeCicco was killed instantly. Bellino survived but lost several toes. Frank DeCicco had served as Gambino underboss from December 17th, 1985 through April 13th, 1986, less than 4 months. The man who had arranged the meeting at Sparks, who had set up his own boss and his boss's newly appointed second for assassination, had lasted in the position he gained from that act for roughly 120 days. The car bomb at Dyker Heights marked the beginning of a period in which the Gambino family under Gotti operated under constant threat from multiple directions simultaneously. The commission was hostile. The FBI was intensifying its investigation, and the internal discipline that had made the family the most powerful organized crime entity in the country was being steadily replaced by something that had no long-term future. The man who had ordered the killing of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bilotti spent the years that followed becoming the most famous gangster in America. John Gotti's instincts ran in the opposite direction from anything Castellano had built or that Bilotti had served. Where Castellano had cultivated invisibility, had avoided cameras, had managed his public presence with the same care he managed his organizational structure, Gotti embraced visibility with what can only be described as hunger. He was known as the Dapper Don, a reference to the custom-made suits and silk ties he wore to court appearances and to the restaurant dinners that became occasions for public theater. He spoke to reporters. He waved to cameras. He held weekly meetings with his senior people at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, a location so well known to law enforcement that photographers could set up outside it and be certain of producing useful images of organized crime leadership walking in and out. The FBI understood what the visibility meant. The surveillance operation at the Ravenite produced recordings of Gotti discussing organizational matters, personnel decisions, and criminal operations with a frankness that the agents monitoring the equipment found difficult to believe. The operational security that had made the Gambino family nearly impenetrable under Castellano, the careful attention to bug locations, the discipline about what was said, where, and to whom, was absent. Gotti believed that his personal charisma and his ability to beat federal cases had made him invulnerable to the process that had ground down every other major organized crime figure of his generation. Salvatore Gravano concluded differently. In 1991, Gravano became a government witness. The man who had sat in the car with Gotti across the street from Sparks Steakhouse on December the 16th, 1985, and watched the shooters move toward the black Lincoln, agreed to tell federal prosecutors everything he knew about the Gambino family's operations and about the specific events of that evening. What he knew was comprehensive, and what he told them was comprehensive. On April 2nd, 1992, a jury convicted John Gotti on racketeering charges that included the murder of Paul Castellano and the murder of Thomas Bilotti. On June 23, 1992, Judge I. Leo Glasser sentenced Gotti to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Gotti had brought the Gambino family to a point where its estimated annual income was $500 million at the time of his accession. He had inherited the most powerful criminal organization in the country. He had spent 10 years making himself famous. He died of throat cancer in federal prison in June of 2002. The organization that Castellano and Bilotti had built and that Gotti had seized survived them all in attenuated form, but the specific institutional character that had made it what it was, the organizational discipline, the deliberate invisibility, the attention to structure over spectacle, had ended on the pavement of East 46th Street on December 16th, 1985, with the two men who had most completely embodied it. There is a question worth sitting with at the end of a story like this one, and it is not the obvious question about what Tommy Bilotti was. The record answers that clearly enough. He was a violent man who spent his life in service to a violent organization, who accumulated bodies and debts in roughly equal measure, who was feared in the neighborhoods where he operated and trusted in the rooms where decisions were made. The record is not silent on any of these points. The question worth sitting with is what his story reveals about how loyalty functions in a system that is built on it. Tommy Bilotti was the most loyal man in the Gambino crime family for 2 decades. That loyalty was not complicated or conditional. It was total. He drove the car. He kept the secrets, including the secret of the boss's affair with his maid. He moved to a house near the boss's mansion so that the proximity was operational as well as symbolic. He spent his days building the boss's concrete company and managing the boss's labor union connections and absorbing the physical risk that came with standing between the boss and whatever the boss's world was capable of producing. He visited his autistic son regularly and said nothing about it because the people around him did not need to know, and because the things that mattered most to him were not things he performed for an audience. The appointment as underboss was not something he sought or lobbied for. It was given to him in a moment of crisis by the man he had served without reservation for nearly 20 years. It was the only significant decision Castellano made in the final 2 weeks of his life that belonged to him alone, uncompromised by legal strategy or organizational politics. He gave his most loyal man the position that his most loyal man had earned by virtue of being what he was for as long as he had been it. The appointment was also the decision that killed both of them. Bilotti held the underboss position for 14 days. He is buried 50 yards from the man he served in the Moravian Cemetery in New Dorp, Staten Island, which is the same ground where both of them had spent most of their lives. The organization they built did not survive the decade. The man who destroyed it died in the same federal prison where the Genovese boss he had made an enemy of would also eventually die. What endured was not the empire. What endured was the specific shape of the story. A man who was loyal beyond the point of self-interest, elevated to visibility at the precise moment that visibility became a death sentence, and killed not because of anything he had done, but because of what his elevation meant to men who had already decided to act. He was not the architect of what destroyed him. He was the driver. It was, in the end, the only role he had ever played, and the one he never got the chance to grow beyond.